Hello everybody, today I'll be showing you how I painted my Necron Cryptek. As usual, I start off with a base coat of Chaos Black from a Rental Cat. And as you can see, I kept the model in two parts for ease of painting. This made it possible to easier read certain areas on the model. I used burnt umber through an airbrush. I sprayed it onto all the parts that I wanted to be white or bone white in the end. The burnt umber is going to serve as the rust color, as the chipping color. Once the burnt umber is dry, I take heavy chipping fluid from AK Interactive, and again through an airbrush I just coat the burnt umber completely with it. I left it to dry overnight, and once dry I took dark earth and I sprayed over the chipping fluid. This is going to act as the deepest shade on the bone parts as well. So I try to get it completely covered. If a little bit of the burnt umber is showing through, that's not a big deal. Once that's dry, I'm going to take light brown and again through an airbrush in a zenithal way, I now apply a base highlight to all the bone parts on the model. This time I try and leave the dark earth visible in the darker areas. This is easier to achieve when you aim the airbrush at a 45-degree angle. Next, bone white was applied to the outer edges of the armor panels. When you do this, try and use the shape of the model to your advantage, so that you just hit the edges of the model. Next I take water, and again through the airbrush I coat the entire model in water. The water will activate the chipping fluid, so that in a little bit we can start working with a brush and a toothpick to scrape some of the paint off and create the chips. As you can see, you can just scratch some of the paint off. You can do this in any mean you desire. Be careful though not to be too enthusiastic. You can chip a lot of paint off quite quickly, and you don't want that to happen. Next, using bone white, I apply an edge highlight to all of the armor panels, and I also apply a highlight on the bottom of the chips. You can draw a thin line on the model to which will have the appearance of a scratch. Next, using metallic black, I basically painted in the entire model except for the armor panels, obviously. At this point I hadn't decided yet on all the colors I was going to use and what was going to go where. So I just painted the entire model metallic. Once that's dry, I took non-oil and I washed all the metallic parts. And once the non-oil dried, I just dry brushed all the metallic parts with gunmetal. Be careful though not to hit the armor panels. Also the more smaller parts I just painted in tiny highlights with a regular brush. Next I took AK Interactive Rust Streaks and White Spirit and I made a mixture. Be sure you do this in a well ventilated room. This stuff stinks really bad and you can get a terrible headache from it as well by sitting in it too long. So basically this wash is meant to do the armor panels with, and I applied pure on the metallic parts. This requires a bit of playing around with it, and because it's quite runny, and you don't want it to be too dark on the armor panels, but you actually do want it to be pretty dark on the metallic parts to have the rusted effect. Great thing about this is if it's dry, or when it's dry, and you decide you want to lighten it up somewhere, you can just take a little bit of white spirit and reactivate it and basically wash it off a bit. It won't go away completely, but you can more or less have it act like a filter then. Once it's dry, after 24 hours, I always leave it to dry overnight. I took the gunmetal again and I applied a lighter dry brush. I didn't went in that heavy as the previous layer. I'm sorry, I'm still having a bit of a cold. And next I took Viking gold and I started blocking in all the golden parts on the model. The smaller parts I just painted in with a small brush, obviously. Once that's done, I took Agrax Earthshade and washed all the golden parts with it. If you accidentally spill a bit on the metallic parts, it's not a really big deal. We're going to dry brush it with silver in a little bit anyway. Back on these large parts, I try not to pull. If it happens a little bit, it's not a big deal. So once the Agrax Earthshade is dry, I move on to Victorian Brass. And I'm going to apply a highlight on all the golden parts. On the larger surfaces I do this by dry brushing. On the smaller surfaces I just paint a small highlight on there. As far as this cape cloak thing goes, I do this from the top to the bottom with this color. In a moment I'm going to apply a silver dry brush as well, and I'll do that from the bottom to the top. This has to do with where you're going to hit the surface you want to get painted. So here we have the silver, and I dry brushed the entire model except for the armor panels with it. This is just to strengthen the light effect. Again, with a regular brush, I do the hard to reach areas. And as you can see right now, I apply the silver on the cloak thingy from the bottom to the top. This is then followed by a wash of Seraphim Sepia on all the golden parts. This helps making the golden look a little bit more dirty, and it also does colors up the silver highlight to a more gold-like color. Next, using pale blue gray, I paint in the helmet of the Cryptek. Once dry, I wash it with Nuln oil to achieve the shading effects I want. I then make a mixture of pale blue gray and white, consisting of one part of each, and I apply a rough basic highlights to the head. I make sure I leave the previous shading and blue gray a little bit visible, and then I add 2 parts white to the previous mixture and I reinforce this highlight, again leaving previous work a little bit visible so we get a nice smooth transition. It's always better to go for 2 thin or 3 thin coats than 1 really rough coat. This is then followed by a final highlight of pure white. And that goes through the same procedures as the previous layers, obviously. Using anthracite gray, I then block in the handle of the staff. And once that's dry, I wash it with Nuln oil. I basically want to get those deeper recesses darker. Then I make a mixture of 4 parts anthracite gray and 1 part white, and I paint the entire staff except for those deep recesses. By adding 2 parts white to the mixture, I apply thin highlights towards the top of each of those, let's call them ribs. And by adding 2 more parts white, I repeat this process. Just a thinner line, only on the really well visible parts. I don't go all the way to the inside of the staff for this. Next I took black and I basically painted everything I hadn't painted yet back to black. Once that's done, I made a mixture of 1 part Hex Legion and 3 parts Warlord Purple, and I started painting in the gems, and I stick to the bottom half, as you can see, in a diagonal way, and I just paint a couple of thin layers on there to get it to get the first color going. So by adding 3 parts Warlord Purple to this previous mixture, I'm going to strengthen the color, and I work towards the bottom on this one. And I do this on all the gems and the lenses as well. Forgot to mention that I didn't do the lenses this way as well. So then again, by adding 3 parts Warlord Purple, I'm going to repeat this process. And as far as these lenses and gems go, you can just keep going until you get the color you like, you want. It's also not that big of a deal if you have a little bit of layers visible. We'll solve that later on. Next, I made a mixture of 3 parts Warlord Purple and 1 part white. And as you can see, again I repeated this process. Just again, a smaller line has been painted. And keep the paint nice and thin, and just apply as many coats as you prefer. I think I went over most of it 2 to 3 times for basically every layer. Then I added 2 parts white to this mixture, and I paint a really small line to the bottom of all the lenses and gems. Next I took pure white and I painted an even smaller line in the bottom of the lenses and the gems, and a small white dot has been applied in the opposite corner of the lens in the black area. Then I took fire red and I painted cables the model has. He only has a few on his stomach. I went over it a couple of times to get a good coverage with the fire red. Then I made a mixture of 2 parts fire red and 1 part white, and I applied a rough highlight to the cables. This turns a bit pink, but that's okay. I then added 1 part white to this mixture, and I repeated the process, strengthening the red color to pink color. Once that's done, I took the fire red again and I made a glaze out of it with a bit of water, and then I went over it a couple of times to get the pink out and turn it back to red again. This time the highlight is visible. Then I took red tone and washed the area to get a bit of a shading in there. So that left a weapon to do and 2 stones on the base. So I started off with a mixture of 4 parts Warlord Purple and 1 part black, and I just painted the weapon. The stone things on the base, they are the exact same procedure. I'm just not showing it. It goes through all the same steps except for the final white step. So once the layer is dry, I took Ruchi Violet and washed the blades with it. Once that's dry, I block in all these little parts with Warlord Purple, leaving the deepest recesses untouched, and I try to work my way outward with this color. Next I made a mixture of 2 parts Warlord Purple and 1 part Bone White, and I'm going to reinforce the previous layer, working outward and leaving little bits of the previous layer visible. to get a little bit of a transition going. So once that layer is done, I add 1 part bone white to the previous mixture, and I repeat this process. And again, I leave the previous layers a little bit visible and just strengthen the color outwards. And by the way, the weapon nearly took me as long as the whole rest of the model. At first I thought I'd just grab my airbrush and do it quickly, and then I figured, well, it might be nice to show it in this manner with a brush. So this is time consuming, but I think the effect is really nice. If you're gonna do this with an airbrush, you basically take the first, second, take a couple of these steps, and once you're done, before the white layer in the end, you pin wash it with the violet, and then you apply the white coat to the model. Next, I took a mixture of 1 part Warlord purple, 1 part bone white, and 1 part white, and I basically painted in an edge highlight, but it's a bit thicker than a really thin one, and this has to do with white lines that are going to be painted on in the next stage. So the painting purple and pink is done now. I took pure white and I just edge highlighted every line I could find. And if you do this, absolutely make sure you don't hit the dark recesses. You can see I leave them open. And as for the side of the weapon, I just painted entirely white. So that leaves us with the basically finished model. I took it for a dull coat, and then I took gloss varnish when the dull coat was dry, and I just gloss varnished all the lenses and gems. I also gloss varnished these stone things. As you can see, it's the same as the weapon, just not a white edge highlight applied to it. So once that has been applied, it's not dry, but it's on there. I took Tamiya Clear X22 and I coated the weapon with it. This has a far more glossy effect than gloss varnish. This is some sort of resin-like substance. It dries really hard. It takes some time to dry, but the effect is really good once done. It's quite thick, so it's not really suitable to put in eyes and stuff like that. So that's why I made the decision to have part gloss varnish and part of the Tamiya Clear. So guys, I hope you liked this video. Please like, share and subscribe if you want to. Dislike as well if you want to, but please be kind enough to tell me what's not good, what's not okay. As a little note, normally I use grass tufts. This time I used a moss tuft to add to the sphere and the atmosphere of the model. So again, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.